Okay, the stream is happy now. It has the right title and everything. So all yours.
Stream is also in place.
I'm going to shut down my video so that way we can really just kind of focus in on
what's going on my end.
Yep.
Oh, she's gone. Okay, there you are. Okay, so I was asked to talk about and give examples of different fiber arts that you'll commonly see in arts and science stuff for people who do judging of things and aren't as familiar with the construction of items, the way, the differences between knit and crochet and other things. Examples of what to look for, what pitfalls you might see, what pitfalls you might run into, just how to distinguish various things. All right, so if we're going to start off with the most basic, it's the most common things people usually submit are knit or crochet items. And a lot of times it's very easy for people to have a hard time telling them apart. So we have examples of knit and crochet. Sorry, my assistant is over here with another camera putting stuff on frame. She's waving hi at you guys. So we've got examples. These two swatches that she's putting in frame now are both done with the exact same yarn. The top one is knit, the bottom one is crochet. So you can see, I did that right, yes? Okay, sorry, I'm blind from this distance. So you can see how the fabrics are subtly different. And if you need us to pull them closer, just speak up and say so. But there are differences in the fabric. And once you learn how to distinguish them, now there are certain types of fabric that you'll see that sometimes it makes it a little harder to distinguish, but these are basics so that you can get an idea of generally what you're going to be looking at. The most common features for knitting, if you want to pick that up and pull it a little bit closer to the camera, is you're going to see a series of V's in the fabric, and that's the knit stitches themselves. If it's the back side of the knit stitches, you see a whole bunch of little repeating, almost like wave-shaped little bumps. And garter stitch is a whole different texture besides. It usually looks what I jokingly call like Ruffles potato chips, because you've got the little ridges from that one side alternating on both ends. And if you pull the fabric open, you can see the V's, but usually they don't jump out and scream. For crochet, you have a whole different set of textures, and you can see how there's a little more space between each stitch. The stitches are a little more individually defined. They don't quite blend into each other as much. Things like that. And with enough exposure and enough practice, a good way to practice is go to the store and look at all of the sweaters, especially in wintertime when they're selling them, and look at them and see if you can tell whether or not they've been knitted or crocheted or some combination thereof. It's good practice. Okay, so those are basic samples. We have got some more advanced examples of knit and crochet. So we're going to start off with the knit example because it's pretty big. And this is knitted lace. In a lot of non-knitting contexts, online websites selling clothes, stores selling clothes, you'll see these knitted lace described as crochet because they don't know the difference. They see holes, they think crochet. Not necessarily true. As you can tell from here, this thing is almost entirely holes, but it's still knitted. And if you were to pick it up and pull it closer, you could see the distinguishing characteristics of the V's once again. There they all are. So, it's knit. I had a lot of fun making that piece, by the way. That was actually pretty fun. Okay, so and then for an advanced example of crochet, a real easy way you can tell crochet from knit is that it's got a lot more flexibility in the shapes that you can make right off the bat. I like to tell people that knit and crochet can be described as knitting being digital, 1, 0, yes, no, knit, purl, because that's all knitting is. It's just permutations of knits and purls. Crochet is analog because you can make a stitch any height you want at any time, and you can place it anywhere you want. And this leaf that I made is a really good example. This leaf was actually, I did not use instructions for this. I found a picture, and Claudia actually helped me determine how to recreate this based on the photo. We had no instructions to go by. And I don't think we got it exact, but we got kind of close. So there's a lot more flexibility in how you can build fabric with crochet. And that's something to pay attention to, because that's a really good way to tell someone's skill level, is if it's something highly advanced looking and their notes say no pattern, then that means that they had to determine where everything falls. And that's going a step above. Okay, so next we're going to look at some finished examples of pieces made both in knit and crochet. Here is a knitted cowl, and it's got a wave pattern called chevron. You can see the little V shapes going on in there. Fuzzy? Just a piece of cat hair. I thought I cleaned it off. It just got blocked today, so it needs a proper bath. So I believe that's the unblocked edge. Yes. So if you, yeah, I was gonna say open it up, there's the block side. This is another thing you will notice about knitting, is that the fabric, especially for things that have direct movement in the fabric, chevrons, the leaves themselves, if they're not finished, blocking is a finishing. It's like taking a sewn garment and ironing it so it looks right when you're done. Forgetting that step is something that shows up. And there, she's trying to put both of them in the frame. So there's the block side, and here's the unblocked side. You can see how one of them is kind of wrinkly and ruffly, and it doesn't have those points quite as pronounced. And what I did was I just blocked half of it, and I just blasted it with steam to make it sit there, like throwing it under an iron. I just didn't physically press the iron on it. So that's an example of a finished project in knitting. That's a cowl. The only thing that's lacking right now, I believe, is just to hide the ends and put buttons on it so it can be closed. A crochet example of the same basic concept, a cowl with a chevron design, but in crochet. So you can see you've got the same wave shape going on, almost the same width, kind of. This one's a little bit wider, but again, you can see how it's got that same directionality to it, but the stitches are more individually defined than they were in the knit. In the knit, you just had bands of fabric in going, slanting in different directions. Here, even though you see the bands of fabric with the slants in them, you can still see the individual stitches. So that's a real easy way to tell it's crochet. Okay, and then we have a couple of other finished projects in knitting and crochet. Here's a hat, knitted, basic little beanie thing. No, I did not make all those colors in there. The yarn came multicolored because I'm a little too lazy for that much work. Yes, laugh at me. It's true. I'm lazy. So there's, yeah, go ahead, laugh at me. But there's an example of how just a basic knitted thing. And I believe this hat, I did not use a pattern. I made this up off the cuff. And I started at the top, right there with the little blue square that she's opened up. And I worked until I got to the bottom. Well, basically to the yarn ran out is what I did. So that's an example of something that somebody could submit that was not from a pattern pre-written. Okay, and then we have a crocheted example. Now this is not a hat, even though it kind of looks like it. It's actually a teapot cozy. It doesn't really fit in the frame because it's kind of big. But as you can see, the stitches are a little bit different. You could almost confuse that for knit. But if you look at it a little more closely, again, you'll see that each individual stitch is a little bit better defined than in a knit fabric. So that's an easy way to tell it's crochet. Yep. And those last two examples were both done in the round. There was no sewing done on those, and that's something else that can also, oop, we lost somebody. Should I wait for them to get back?
No, just go ahead and keep running. People can come in and go as they like on these sessions.
Cool. Okay. Sorry, I've got a little listing of things I'm supposed to be covering because I think I'm going kind of fast.
Yeah, do you want to pause and do you have any questions?
Yes, before we move on to the next major section of things I've got to show. Anybody have any questions on what I've thrown in your faces so far?
I'm not seeing any questions so far coming in.
I am seeing a couple of like voice activity, but I can hear very faintly. I'm not sure if they're talking to us and I can barely hear them or what.
You know, I can see voice activity on Makushi's end. I think that happens whenever someone else is talking. So I think it's just her microphone picking up a little bit of background noise, but not giving us feedback, which
Yeah, I think it's
is
picking
totally
up you,
fine.
actually. Yeah, but then there's another. Oh, that's yours. Okay, I was like, I see another one with a green border. It's yours.
Yeah, it's mine. I've got 2 accounts in here so that I can make sure I capture all the sound.
Gotcha. Okay, fair. But yeah, so any questions on how to distinguish knit from crochet? Any strange examples you've seen and that you're wondering how it would have been easier to distinguish them? And I know of all people, Katrisa's kind of a master of masking crochet to look like knit. She's actually worked at it just to mess with people.
Yeah, it's those V's. So, Kirsa, can we get one of the knit examples shown? And then the tea koozie, I think.
Can you get one of the knit examples up there along with that tea koozie?
So like the basic, the basic knit example, knit swatch. Yeah, that would be fine.
There you go. So that's knit and crochet side by side in frame.
On the hat portion where we see those V's, and right now those V's are pointed up, so they look like up arrows. We have that in knit. And then in crochet, you can see the same sort of V happening there, but you don't have the next V stitch growing out of that V stitch. There's this kind of horizontal bar, almost like a ceiling or a floor that's getting you ready to start the next V. And what she was mentioning in terms of me trying to learn how to mask it is me trying to find a way with crochet to hide those horizontal bars, those ceilings and those floors, so my fabric looks like the black and multicolored hat, but was really done using the technique of the blush and cream multicolored one. And it's a challenge to make that work properly, and I found that it really restricts me in terms of what kinds of fabrics I'm able to build. I'm not able to build a flat fabric. I have to build tubes in order to keep things lined up properly.
I bet you there's a way to do it. It's just, it would involve a little more
I theorize. Yeah, no, I theorize that because when you crochet, when you're building fabric back, like forward and backwards, you're running like this, almost like a typewriter. And when you get to the end of the line, you flip the fabric around so you're looking on the opposite face as you build the next row up. And so what I think the solution is for me to build it this way. And when we get to the end, instead of flipping it around, I flip my needle around and I build it backwards, which is going to require me learning how to do it with my other hand. And
crochet left-handed for that purpose.
Yeah, woefully not ambidextrous with my yarn.
The other thing that comes to mind is to kind of do what knitting does, where you have the knits and the purls, which those are actually the same stitch, just one you're working the yarn towards you as you create the fabric, the other you're working the yarn away from you as to create the fabric. So you end up with the V's all facing the same direction. I kind of can't help but wonder if you could do a single crochet from facing the backside.
I'll have to play with that later and I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
On yarn wrangling part 2.
Yeah. That's something for future playing with. Okay, so we're ready to move on?
Totally.
So no questions from the peanut gallery? Feel free to throw peanuts. Get my attention.
Yes, please throw peanuts, especially from our newly minted Serpent Knight who does arts and crafts. He's on channel, yes, Thadagrin. His icon is the one that's sitting on the Iron Throne, it looks like.
Yes. Okay.
That's Thadagrin. But I believe his knighthood was leatherwork and armor. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong. So this is probably outside of his wheelhouse.
Well, you never know. I mean, someone may decide that they want to make something that resembles armor, but
I mean, I've played with metal wire, crochet metal wire, and so the question is, could I get a sufficient enough gauge with sufficient enough hand strength to knit or crochet metal wire like chainmail-ish, I've discovered I do not have the hand strength to even do beaded wires, so anything that's armor grade is out the window. But
yeah, Viking knit comes to mind, which is basically just doing an I-cord tube and then pulling it through like a gauged hole to strengthen the wire and make it a certain diameter. It's insane. It's hard on the hands. You will never see me do it.
Challenge at Thad to see about doing that, because the man makes Damascus steel.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll see if I can't find some pictures of his work, and I will throw it in the general event chat text area in a bit.
Cool.
Okay, I'll let you continue. Okay. Sorry.
So moving on. Now we're going to cover, so we now know that, knit and crochet, two different kinds of fabric, and basically how to identify them. Now it would be nice to know how to identify the skill level of the person creating the fabric, because that is something that sometimes comes into play. It's like, okay, this is a person who is new to the craft, new to making these things. They should be judged on a slightly different scale from someone who's been doing it for going on 25 plus years. Because I'm sorry, if I make stupid newbie mistakes, you need to call me out on them. If a newbie is trying and they're really trying hard, then they shouldn't be slapped down for a good attempt. All right, so starting with, here we go. I actually went and stole my sister's daughter, stuck a pair of knitting needles in her hands and said, knit something. Has she ever knitted before? Okay, she's done maybe a few hours of knitting previously. And so she's not got any actual experience. I don't think she's ever made an actual thing. So it was kind of her reteaching herself how to knit from almost nothing. And this was her little practice piece that she made. Yes, you can see how it's curving. So there was some stuff going on at the beginning that wasn't quite right. She's got some holes that we caught, some stitches that got dropped with a safety pin. Definitely beginner fabric. And you can probably see, if we hold it still, that there's some spots where the yarn looks looser or tighter than others. That's called, I don't know, she's got pretty good consistent gauge in crochet. I don't know about knitting. Sorry? Somebody said something?
And you'll automatically get an email a month out. Hey,
oh, sorry, I'm not muted, and Dolan is having his fighting company meeting in the same room, so my mic, sorry, I'll mute myself.
Okay, that's what I'm hearing. Okay, yes. So this is an example of, and I would not expect an example this extreme to come up, but this is kind of an, worst case scenario. This is someone who's knitted less than maybe 5 hours in their lifetime. So it gives you an example of some of the beginnery kind of things you might be looking for: inconsistent gauge, starting and stopping a little bit inconsistently, potentially drop stitches, things like that. And that can help you determine if this person's still learning the skills, as opposed to someone who's got the skills, but you're just being lazy or sloppy, which I will admit I've done that too. Okay.
And if we're talking about awards, if you're seeing a piece like this, and this is, they've never entered anything before, this is probably still worth a first level dragon, because if they are just picking up this craft and this is the first time they've done it and they've only got like 4 hours, however long it took them to figure out how to do it off a YouTube video. And I mean, these kinds of mistakes are perfectly reasonable for very entry level, which is what the first level of dragon can represent.
Yes. So this would be something it's their first ever attempt at doing this. This is the first ever attempt at submitting something. It should be taken into account that this is the first ever kind of thing. If I were to submit something and say this is my first ever submission, you would still want to judge it very harshly, because I've been doing this for years and years. Okay, then we have some crochet examples also. Again, the same niece. She has more experience with crochet than she does with knitting. You can still see, though, she's not got a lot of experience down. She's got some. You look at one side, and you can see being an example there, how the angle of the triangle is that was redundant, wasn't it? Very smooth and consistent. But on the other side, you can see that there's a little bit of like waviness to the edge of the fabric. that is where she didn't quite consistently change the width of the fabric as she was going. And that's a skill level that gets learned, learning where to place stitches in crochet to make a smooth edge on the fabric. That's not an easy skill. That is something that even I still struggle with from time to time. So it's definitely not a beginner skill. And if you see that on a very first ever, I'm just now learning submission, that is something to take into account when you go to judge it. Again, if I were to do that, you'd be like, really? Come on, you know better. And then we have another example. And I like this one because it's a bigger piece. And again, it's got the edges going on, but also in the fabric itself, there's a couple of little places where her stitches don't quite look the same as the ones around them. For the most part, her stitching is extremely consistent, and that's actually a very good thing. One of the hardest things to learn to do when you start a yarn craft like this, knitting, crocheting, weaving really hard, is a consistent tension in the fabric, making the fabric look consistent across the surface area. You know, when you're sewing, you know how it's hard to get a nice straight stitch line. The same way, it's very hard to get a nice consistent tension in your fabric when you're knitting or crocheting. And this is a good example of someone who's still learning the thing, and you can see where she's got the occasional spot that's not quite right, but for the most part, her fabric is extremely consistent. And that's a very good sign. That means she's on the right track, and she just needs to keep practicing and doing more.
Now, as you're talking about these different skill levels, what if you have someone that lists, you know, they've got tons of experience with crochet? Say for myself, I'm primarily a crocheter. And so I'd list on my write-up that I have 20 plus years crocheting. But then I turn in a knitted piece and I say, this is my first knitted attempt. I've, you know, only been at it for a week or two in crafting this project, and this is my first one. How much skill level from crochet transfers over to knit that you expect in order to say this is a knitted beginner's piece, but with someone who has this much experience in a related-ish field?
That's actually very subjective, and that's a difficult one to describe, because there are people who, and I always say that everybody's brain is a little bit different. Everybody processes the way you make fabric a little bit different. Some people can do both knit and crochet without even noticing that they're different. You know, it's just, I'm making fabric with yarn. I just happen to be using a hook today instead of 2 needles, or a big old metal frame instead of a pair of knitting needles, that kind of thing. But then there are other people who, even though they knit like amazingness, struggle with crochet, or people who can crochet things that make my brain explode, thread crochet. Just, I do not thread crochet. You'll notice not a single sample is in thread. And knitting is a struggle for them constantly. And I've tried to figure out what could be a potential cause for that kind of variation in the way people work and learn the different crafts. And one thing I've determined is that crochet is much more single-handed. One hand does a lot more work than the other. So if you get someone who's very heavily left-handed or very heavily right-handed, they might take to crochet a little bit better than knitting. But that's not always true, because I've seen someone who was like terminally incapable of using their non-dominant hand take to knitting like a duck to water. And then people who are ambidextrous struggle with, you know, it's, everybody's different, and it's really hard to determine. It would probably have to, I mean, from my side of the fence, I usually am doing what I call technical support for knitting and crochet. People will come to me with the problems they're having with whatever project they're on, and I help them figure out how to do what they're needing to do a little bit better, or a little more efficiently, whatever. So I see them actually forming the stitches and using the needles, holding the yarn, and I can see where they can possibly make what they're doing a little more efficient for their own hands and their own techniques. I'm a little bit of a digression. I am not a fan of somebody who says this is the right way to do it, this is the only right way to do it, because every person is different, and every person has the way to do it that works best for their brain and their hands. Prime example, Patricia, she is a crocheter first. When she went to learn to knit, she tried to hold the yarn in her right hand the way I do, and struggled and said, screw it, I'm going to hold it like I do when I crochet. Picked up the yarn in her left hand and was able to knit more readily. And if I had told her, no, you must hold the yarn in your right hand, that's the only right way to do it, she never would have tried because it didn't work well for her. So that's an example.
Hashtag true story.
Yes, that's a true story. Actually, I think of the three of us siblings, I'm the only one who holds the yarn in the right hand.
Because you're crazy.
Because I learned from a book and I didn't know any differently.
Yeah, whereas I learned watching Mom and watching you and YouTube videos, and then finally just throwing my hands in the air and go, I'm going to do it this way because this is how it feels right, and screw all of you.
Yes. And that's usually what I tell people is that's like, you know what? I don't care how you hold the needle. I don't care how you hold the yarn or how you hold the crochet hook. This is the motion I want you to generate with the yarn and the needle or hook. And if you make those motions, you will form the stitch you want to form. And I don't care how you're holding the yarn. I mean, you could hold the hook between your toes and hold the yarn with your teeth. I don't care. If you're getting the fabric you want, good enough, right? Okay. So those are examples of skill level differences. And those were kind of extreme examples. You know, we took someone who's only got hours of experience with the crafts and compared with the stuff I was making, which is decades of experience. And there's a whole spectrum in there. And people learn at different paces. So you could have someone who's been knitting for 5 years and is still struggling with some of the basics, or someone who's been knitting for a year and a half and just picks up the skills like that. It's really subjective, and that's difficult gray area to decipher, unfortunately. But we're going to move on because another challenge point, especially for submitted things for judging, is assembly. When somebody knits or crochets an item in pieces and then has to sew it together, you're going to have potential for pitfalls in the actual assembly. And again, I got someone who only has a small amount of experience with assembling items to sew these pieces together. So you can see that there's unevenness at the top. She's over here going, no, don't look at it. But I mean, and she was like, should I fix it? Because I just noticed that it's been wrong. Like, no, leave it because we want that example. So and this has kind of an extreme case of things not going right, because I on purpose told her, no, don't fix your mistakes. She was seeing her mistakes as she was making them, and she was like, I want to fix this, but I'm not going to. So this would be, like I said, this is an extreme example, but it gives you a few ideas of things to look for that could be somebody's skill level not being quite up to the assembly that they did, or they did it in a rush last minute and didn't realize that they'd made mistakes, or who knows. But you can see how the assembly it's not quite pristine. And for someone with, say, your decades of experience, if I submit something with that kind of assembly, you know that either somebody slipped me some alcohol or something bad happened. Go ahead and laugh at me. It's okay.
Tipsy sewing.
Yes. Yeah. Tipsy knitting is actually a thing. I don't do it because I usually knit insane lacy things. And yeah, that's just a recipe for disaster. But some people swear by the tipsy knitting. Okay, whatever. So then we have an example of a piece assembled. I did this one. This is decades of experience. I have sewn entire garments together. And actually, while you've got that there, I've got a garment right here that I made actually back in 1997. So this was just about not quite 5 years of experience with knitting. And I'm going to put myself on voice activation now so that I can hold it up and keep talking, because I've been on push to talk this whole time. It's almost like I have practiced changing that setting. So here's a sweater that I made back in 1997. And yes, it is a very, very 90s silhouette. I know. And Dahlin could probably wear this. It is that oversized. But the reason that I showed it as an example, because this is sewn together. This is seamed. Because that's what the instructions called for. But, I mean, the seams are, if it weren't for the fact that the yarn is multicolor,
I couldn't tell the difference.
There's a little bit of like variation in the individual stitches where they butt up against each other. And that is an indication of where the seam line is. So you can see how on this one, there's a little bit of a variation in the fabric where they run up against each other. And then in the blue one over there, if you pick that up and hold it up a little bit closer, you can see how the stitches, there's kind of, they almost look like they're just one piece of fabric. That is the difference between about 4 to 5 years of experience versus 25 years of experience right there.
Versus sit down and do it and don't fix your mistakes because you're a noob.
Yeah, versus the noob, here, we're going to show an extreme example of how bad it could get. And then here's the sleeve seam, and you can see how there's shaping in the sleeve. And I can't see what I'm doing anymore. But you can see how there's this fabric is angled and then sewn into each other. So this is, whenever anyone asks me about sewing together a garment, I bust out this one because it's got all of the different possible assembly types, including sewing things in different directions to each other. This seam right here was the bane of my existence for about a week, putting the sleeves in. I thought sewing on a sewing machine and putting sleeves in was a nightmare. This is so much worse because this, you can see every little thing. Thankfully, at the time I lived up in Dallas, there was a yarn store and they had wonderful people who showed me everything on how to do it. I'm going to mute for just a moment, okay? I'll be right back.
Okay. Attack of the father.
Yes, that was Dad aggro was what that was. Okay, so that's an example, real world example of a finished piece. And I love to freak people out because they're like, that sweater is impressive. I'm like, yeah, it's about $160 worth of yarn. And that throws them on the floor. They shock, oh my God, so much money. And then I tell them that this sweater is now over 20 years old, approaching 25 years old, and it still looks like when I made it. How long does a Old Navy sweater last? Okay, next thing is a different type of construction for sweaters is in the round. And that's something you'll sometimes see. Oh, we were going to show the crochet pieces too, weren't we? Well, let's show since we're still talking about knitting. I have one. I did not make this one myself. My mom actually made this one. This is a sweater that was made in the round. There are no sewn seams anywhere except I think maybe this little keyhole neck was sewn closed.
No, I don't think it was.
You don't think it was?
I don't think that it was.
It looks like it was.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, it looks like it was.
Fine, be that way.
But, here again, we have sleeves on a garment, but unlike that last one, there is no seam. There is no sew line anywhere. And this is a slightly more advanced, well, depends on the technique. Wow, everything is looking funny colors because of this. So you can see how down the side, again, there's no sew line. And that's just a different construction method that's completely valid and acceptable. This can sometimes take a little more skill than doing the flat pieces. It really depends on how the individual learned. If they learned pieces in the round first, this is easier for them. If they learned flat pieces, sewing them together can be easier. It really is, again, subjective to the individual. But this can also potentially have problems with fit, because if you make it too small or too big, the whole thing will be off, not just one piece of sweater. I wish we still had your baby sweater.
The Franken sweater.
Yeah, the Franken sweater. My sister made a sweater for her first kid, and the sleeves were different lengths, the bodies were different sizes. At one point, I think she had to add a piece to one of the fronts because it was so much shorter than the rest of it. When it was finished, it was assembled so well you couldn't tell where she had pieced it together.
It's a thing I do.
Yeah, it's a thing she does, as you can tell. Her seams don't line up. But once the thing was assembled and on the kid's body, you couldn't really tell. And that's kind of the impressive thing about some of these things. So those are examples of different kinds of assembly and knitting. Crochet has the same thing. So first we have some seamed pieces. We have, is that mine or yours first?
Yours.
Okay, so this is the one that I sewed together in crochet.
I should have made you guess. That's what you're trying to.
Okay, hang on. Oh, okay, now I can tell. Yeah, I have old people eyes. I get it. You should see me trying to thread a needle. That gets funny.
It is hilarious.
She's watched me thread a sewing needle, not a tapestry needle for yarn, but an actual sewing needle. And yeah, there's much amusement going on there. The sewing machine's even funnier because that one I can't get close enough to really see what I'm doing. Okay, so this was assembled in crochet pieces assembled. Crochet is much more of a challenge to sew together than knitting because you don't have as clearly defined edges on crochet in general. You don't have very specific, here's the stitches where they end. I know that sounds weird when I said that crochet has more clearly defined individual stitches, but the edges tend to be a little more, well, analog, I guess you could say. So sewing them together is definitely much more of a subjective thing. You have to, yeah, there you go. Nice example of, an edge on knitting and an edge on crochet. Crochet edges tend to have a little more wave to them just from the nature of the way the fabric is built. And knitting is much more static.
And I think that explains, as a predominant crocheter, that explains the reason why I don't like crocheting bits and pieces and stitching them together at the end. And if the pattern calls for make it in individual pieces, seam it and piece it together later, I will invariably rewrite the pattern on the fly to avoid having to do that. And I will turn it into a in the round no seam. Because I don't like sewing crocheted things. It makes me very unhappy.
Sewing crocheted things is definitely a different skill level. It is doing it so that you have a smooth fabric and the edge where the pieces are joined doesn't look obviously joined is definitely something that, even mine is not perfect. It definitely takes a lot of practice to where you get to the point where the pieces assembled together look smoothly assembled. So hello, newcomer, or bye.
or bye, something.
Something. So that's something to take into account, is that crochet seems to be a much greater challenge for assembling flat pieces than the average knitted piece. And then here is again the lower skill level, the more beginnery skill level assembly. She also used a different technique for assembling it. This is actually a more common crocheted assembly technique, crocheting the pieces together instead of sewing them together. My piece, I actually stitched them together with a needle. Hers are actually crocheted together, which you'll see a lot in tapestries, quilt type crochet, blankets, basically flat pieces, things that don't have to be worn on the body, so that the seams having a texture is not quite as crucial, and you can make them a visual effect. Done well, a visual seam like that can have a very positive visual impact on the fabric and on the finished piece. Done poorly, it's a glaring obvious, ooh, something went wrong there. You kind of want to go and take it out and redo it because it just is cringeworthy. But so those are two different ways that crochet can be assembled, and it's always going to be a challenge. And anyone who can do that and make it look smooth and flawless clearly knows your stuff. And as you can tell, even I'm not at 100% on that. I'm still learning that part because like Claudia, I don't enjoy seaming crochet. I would much rather just make it all in one piece, because you can. Crochet is so much easier to adjust on the fly, I suppose. So those are some possibilities. Okay, here's another example of knitting in the round, smaller pieces, something that's going to be a little easier to see up close. These gloves are, again, there's no seams, no sewing. And I made them up as I went. Those have no pattern. So I don't know if I could ever recreate them.
And I think that's the challenge when you are doing something with a pattern, without a pattern. With a pattern, it can be replicated as many times as you want. And, you know, you can turn it into a commission piece if you learn how to make it fast enough. But when a thing says no pattern or made up on the fly, it's a one-of-a-kind, unique piece, no matter how simple, because these gloves look really simple. Like, it's just fabric.
It's just a little pair of gloves. But when you take into account that without any predetermined instructions, I had to do measurements to make sure that that thumb hole was neither too big nor too small. Now, these were made for a male, so they're probably going to be a little bit loose looking on her hands. So they were designed to be close fitting, and you can see how one side of the fabric has more visible vertical lines than the other. It's not actually all stockinette. It's got ribbing in the body. And you can see how there it's smooth, and then here it's got the vertical lines. So I changed the texture of the fabric to make them fit the body, the hand shape a little bit better without having to do any of the shaping that would be required to meet all of these angles that the human hand has that most people forget about. That was my being lazy, I suppose. Yeah. Well, efficient, intelligent laziness. There we go.
Intelligent laziness.
Yeah, efficiency is intelligent laziness. So that's another example of things done in the round, no seams. And it can be done with knitting just like it can in crochet. Although crochet seems to lend itself better to seamless pieces. But definitely the assembly is still a thing that can make or break a good garment.
Got about 15 minutes left.
We've got about 15 minutes left. Okay. So we've got one last section. This is talking about the difference between hand spun and mill spun mass produced machine manufactured. This is something that will also come up probably kind of a lot. Oops. The major difference is that the hand spun yarns are not as consistent over long term as machine spuns, because the machines do everything and it's very static in how they do it. So the thickness of the yarns are always extremely consistent. And hand spun yarns, because humans are involved, there's going to be some variation. And especially if you're working with a spindle, let me reach up and grab a spindle. One of these and one of these. If you're working with a drop spindle, you've got various kinds. I'm not going to really go into detail on these. You've always got the potential for variation because of how tired you are. Did you have a bad, stressful day at work, and are you stressed out? Because the human element is involved here, you can have a lot more variation in the thickness of the yarn, just even if you're doing the exact same motions. Here's another spindle. The exact same motions, the exact same wool, the exact same spindle. Just having a headache, having had a bad day, having spent all day typing, and now you're trying to do some drop spindling and your hands are tired. These can affect the yarn that you make, and that shows in the finished yarns. Mill spuns, you don't get that because it's a machine doing it all. So here's an example of a crocheted piece made from hand spun. I did not spin this. This was yarn that a friend of mine spun up. The pale part is cashmere and the dark part is wool. So also different animal fibers can affect the appearance of the finished spun yarn. And you can see how the white gets thicker and thinner in places. The colorful, I'm trying not to use a specific name for the color because that is actually a multicolor. It's got greens and reds and browns and stuff in it. So unless you look at it really close, you can't tell. It just looks brown. But you can, if you were to look at it close enough and study the fabric, you could see the variations in the thickness of the yarn, and that would probably tell you it's most likely hand spun. And that adds a level of complexity, that adds more effort, more time, more work that went into that piece. So for judging, if it says it's been hand spun first, take that into account when you go to judge a piece, because store-bought yarn is easy. Store-bought yarn is quick and simple and mindless and really easy. You know, that's kind of eye-searing, isn't it? Let me grab a gray. I happen to be knitting something before we started. So, you know, get this stuff. It's super consistent. It's going to look different in a finished piece than the hand-spun yarn does. The gloves would have been an example of the gloves we had before, would also have been an example of a mass-produced yarn used for a finished product. So, I mean, just looking at that, those are apples and oranges because one's knit and one's crochet. But if you look at them closely, you can tell right off that the gloves, the yarn itself is extremely consistent from beginning to end, even though it's multicolored. The hand spun, if you look at it closely, you can see the variations in the width from the handmade nature of it. So that's a good way to tell when you've got something that's, you know, you can add that extra tick the box of it's been hand spun.
And how does having mill spun versus hand spun increase the complexity of a knit or crocheted piece?
Well, somebody has to have the skill to make the yarn.
We're not talking about that the person, the crafter crocheting or knitting actually made it. Maybe they went out and they purchased someone else's hand spun.
Okay, which is valid because a lot of my hand spun is not mine. There's also the fact that hand spun yarn has a different feel to it. It has a different, just the amount of air that gets caught into the fibers as they're twisted is different from the way the machine does it. There's so many variations in the hand spun itself that come up just from the way that they were made that a machine doesn't really run into. You know, a machine is always going to have a certain thickness, a certain amount of air that's trapped, a certain amount of twist.
So like this one that I'm showing is hand spun, and there's a section there that's really fat, and then it goes really skinny.
Yes, I have a sample of that too. This is actually my first ever hand spun. And you can see how it's kind of skinny and it's got some like almost telephone cord looking coily bits in there. And then it gets fatter and fuzzier. And that's from the learning process. You know, there's going to be variations in the thickness of the yarn and variations in how much twist got it put into various things. And that is something that a machine really, a machine can be programmed to imitate it. But even then, you can tell when the thick and the thin spots happen, it'll be much more consistent. And so it's still machine made. It's still mill spun, mass produced. And another thing, that was, both were singles. This is plied yarn. So the plying is also a factor that comes in when you're doing hand spun yarn, because how it's plied also affects the feel of the fabric, the thickness of the fabric, how it knits up, how it crochets up. Good question. Plying is where you take 2 strands or 3 strands or 4 or however many you want, or 1 strand to make it. It's putting multiple strands together to make a yarn as opposed to having just a single piece of spun yarn. And there are differing schools of thought on what's better. And in my opinion, it's whatever best suits the function of the piece you're making. If you have a piece that the balance of the yarn, because plying also changes the balance of the yarn. If you've ever worked with a mill spun yarn that is just a single ply and you notice that your fabric starts to parallelogram instead of staying rectangular, that's because of the twist. There's nothing to offset the twist. When you ply it, you're offsetting the twist with a second piece so that your fabric stays straighter. That's why the vast majority of mill spun yarns are plied. 1, because they can just set it to one setting, skinny, and then just put multiple pieces together to get whatever thickness they want. 2, they end up with balanced yarn. and people don't complain. So those are the main differences. And we've got examples of mill spun and hand spun yarns, and how mill spun will sometimes try to imitate hand spun. Let's go with the yarns here. Yep. So obviously you can tell which one is the mill spun because it's in a ball with a label still. And I bought this yarn at Gage here in Austin. It could be a discontinued yarn. I am kind of bad about buying discontinued yarns a lot. And then the multicolor is actually some hand spun that a friend of mine spun, and she is what I consider a master lace spinner. She spins lace waste yarns that just defy belief.
I want that.
You can't have it, it's mine. Yes. So, and she was the one who spun the Cowles yarn. In fact, I think there's only one hand spun example in here that is not hers because her stuff is so good. I'm just like, her stuff, yes. So you can see how this hand spun, the mill spun that we've got in the ball, is trying to be similar in a look and feel. It's not going to be exactly the same because the fiber content is different, but you can see how it wants to be like the hand spun. And this is a case of the hand spun and the mill spun trying, one of them is trying to be similar. I think actually she was trying to achieve a mill spun lace weight yarn in her hand spun, is what this one is an example of. Either way, it's gorgeous. So then we have another example. And this is a mill spun yarn made to look like hand spun. And again, you can see it's got the label on it. And if you look at it a little bit closer, if you put it up on the end, you can see more of the yarn like that. You can see how there's spots that are a little thicker and a little thinner. This is a kind of a high-end Japanese yarn. If you ever hear somebody just start gushing and the word Noro comes out of their mouth, this is Noro. This stuff, I mean, you just say the word Noro and people who know what it is will just immediately start going, oh my God, because it is. It's stunning. But because it tries to emulate hand spun, it's got that inconsistency of thickness. And a lot of knitters or crocheters who aren't familiar with hand spun don't really understand the variation in thickness, and it starts to get on their nerves. They're like, I don't like this. Why does it keep going thick? Because it's made to emulate hand spun. And we have a hand spun example. Another Robin spun. This yarn is spun singles, just like the Noro. This is actually hand spun. And just for an extra level of brain explosion, it is Sari Silk Remnants spun. Can we say brain? When I realized what it was, I about fell over. And I've got oodles, and you can't have it. It's mine.
Damn it.
Sorry, you can't have it. But so you can see how this hand spun, that the Noro was made to try and emulate a hand spun of this style. And the previous one, the 2-ply hand spun, was made to emulate that machine made 2-ply. Yeah. So those are and that's ways to tell them apart. I mean, you could see a Noro thing and be, oh, wow, this looks hand spun. But then if you look at it a little closer, you realize, wait, no, the twist is very consistent, even though the thickness varies. That's a mill spun. And that's all right. Skill level. We're about done. Okay, the last thing we're about done is, let's go one last set of samples. This is another example of hand spun trying to look like mill spun. This is sock yarn, and that little sample there is actually what's called Navajo ply, if anyone ever hears of that. That is a different way of plying the yarn, and you can see how it's made to look like the sock yarn right next to it. So that one actually, if that were knitted up, it probably would be almost indistinguishable from mill spun. The white is the mill spun. Yeah, see, I mean, she even had to ask me which one's a mill spun because she couldn't tell them apart. But that's pretty much it. So when you look at a piece, there's so many factors to take into account. Sometimes it's worth it to go find someone who is skilled in these things and say, help me What? Oh, no.
Dawn.
Okay. To go find someone who is skilled in these things and say, hey, I've got a piece to judge. I would like you to help me.
Was that
look at it. Hi, darling. It helped me determine, what things are noteworthy and what things are points for improvement. And don't be afraid to ask. I have no problems with that. You can always, ask to bug me. And then here's the hand spuns that we were showing earlier in samples. That's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions? I didn't leave any time for questions. I'm so sorry.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. We are at the hour mark.
Right at 5 o'clock. Yeah.
Right at 5 o'clock. You ended that one perfectly. Thank you so much.
I was meant to leave time for questions and answers, and I didn't.
No. Well, I mean, we did some questions.
You know how to get in touch with me.
Yeah,
yes, there was the question and answer section in the middle too.
Yeah, so I kind of jumped in on that. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
But yeah,
if anyone does have any questions, you can catch me through Katrisa just about any time. And I'm a night owl, so if it's 10 p.m. and you're like, it's making my brain hurt, I want to know, she can probably catch me. I will most likely still be awake.
Except that I'm probably asleep because I am not a night owl. School teachers cannot be night owls. But she is connected to this Discord, so you can send her an @ message or a private Discord message to get a hold of her, so that way she can tech support your yarn.
Yes, I do yarn tech support.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and cut off the stream, but stay tuned because coming up is going to be the Perspective Matters painting class with Inebriarts featuring MidReign.